Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adult Learning Theory to Practice. My name is Laura Otera, and I am your presenter today. And to give you a little bit of background about me so you know how I know a little bit about the topic. So I work currently at CSU Monterey Bay, that's California State University, Monterey Bay in California. In the US, and I have a PhD in leadership with a specialization in instructional technology. I also have a master's degree in education with an emphasis in online teaching and learning, and my bachelor's degree is in communication with English subject matter as my emphasis because I wanted to be a teacher, and that's what I'm doing now. I am both the online education coordinator at CSU Monterey Bay, and I'm also an instructor for the communication design bachelor's degree program and the master's degree program in instructional science and technology. And in that program, we do emphasize adult learning and working with technology and just the different ways that we can connect now to learn. So let's go into what we will do today. So after the workshop today, I hope that you will be able to identify adult learning theory principles. I also expect that you'll be able to apply adult learning principles to your teaching practices. I also hope that you will be able to strategize how to implement practical activities in your courses that are going to inspire your students as adult learners. And I also hope that you'll be able to articulate the importance of integrating adult learning principles as related to the social work program and the work-based practicum. So let's get into it, and let's start with andragogy. What is andragogy? So there's andragogy and there's pedagogy. Pedagogy is all about teaching children, right? So teaching kids is pedagogy. Andragogy is adult learning. So it's all about how we teach adults and how that differs from the practices that we have when we're teaching kids. So Malcolm Knowles, he is one of the established experts in the field, and he identified 6 key principles of adult learning theory. Now, the first of those is that adults need to know why they're learning something. And we're going to go into each one of these more in depth, and we're actually going to practice with some of these concepts. But just to give you that overview, the first principle is that adults need to know why they're learning something. They also have something called self-concept. And the idea of self-concept is that adults are self-directed and they are responsible for their own decisions. They require autonomy. They require the ability to make their own decisions, right? So we have to work with that when we are working with adult learners. The third principle is that adults benefit from the life experience that they already have. So adults can draw on their life experiences, and they're actually a wonderful resource for their peers to enhance the learning environment. And the fourth principle is that adults are ready to learn when they see the relevance. So when they see the benefit of what they're going to learn, they have to understand how this is going to support them, and then they'll be ready to learn. So we'll talk about those strategies. And the fifth principle is that adult learning is solution oriented. So we want to help adult learners to apply their new knowledge to actually solve problems, right, that they're experiencing. That's something that's going to really motivate them to be engaged in your lesson. And the sixth principle is all about intrinsic motivation. That's internal motivation. So there's the idea of being internally motivated to engage in learning, as opposed to being externally motivated to engage in learning. So it helps to talk about how this is different with adults versus children, right? So when we are working with adult learners, we don't have the same kind of, so we as adult learners don't have the same kind of dependence on our teachers that children do, right? They depend on their teacher. They rely on their teacher. And children also have really limited they have really limited experience, right? So they don't have the benefit of being able to rely on their prior experience to connect with their new learning. So again, that's our benefit that we can, of working with adult learners, is that they have that experience to draw from. Children don't need to be ready to learn. They don't need to have that self-concept. They can just jump in. They're following a curriculum. They're doing the thing they're supposed to do. Whereas adults learn when they have a need to, when they see the relevance of it. Children also focus on subjects as opposed to adults who are focused on the applications of their new knowledge to the problems they are experiencing in the world. Children tend to need external motivation as opposed to that internal motivation to learn. And again, children don't really need to see they don't really need to see how they're going to apply the things that they're learning in the way that adults absolutely do. Children also have to follow the pacing of the instructor. They don't have the ability, they don't necessarily have that responsibility yet, right, to be able to set their own pace in the way that adults can. So it's important to know that there's very, very different approaches to this. And that's what we're going to get into in depth. So let's start with the first principles, that adults need to know why they're learning something. So adults need to know why they're learning something. They also need to know what they're learning, okay? And the way that we can use this, the way that we can live this principle in our teaching, is by providing learning goals and outcomes. So you may have heard the terms learning goals and learning outcomes, and there's slight differences between the two. A learning goal is more of simplified language. So we are explaining very simply to the adults what we're going to do today, right? Like, what is the goal of the learning? It's very, very simple. Whereas it's also focused on like what we're going to do, right? What we're going to do right now, what we're going to do in the future, as opposed to learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are, they're more specific, okay? They are more focused on what our learners need to be able to do, right? So you can see that when we write learning outcomes, when we write like the goals of, whatever our lesson is going to be, it's valuable for us to visualize what our learners need to be able to do, right? Because when we can visualize what they need to be able to do and what they will be able to do as a result of participating in our training or lesson or whatever it is, they are going to benefit from that, right? It helps us when we design instruction, and it helps them because then they understand why they're learning a thing, right? Like, what is the practical value of this? So we do that with really clear learning goals and really explicit, really clearly written learning outcomes. And then we communicate them to those learners so that way they can see it for themselves. That's not just for us to hold on to. It's valuable for them to have access to that information as well. And we can also do this by preparing, helping our adult learners understand how the learning that they're going to do is going to prepare them to do the thing, and how it's going to help them to avoid negative consequences, right? It's very motivating when you know how this learning is going to support you. So if I tell you that by following these steps, by writing learning goals and outcomes, and by providing those goals and outcomes to your students, This is going to better motivate your learners. You're more likely to do it, right? Because you know what the point is of you doing the thing. So this is why I'm sharing this with you, right? And this is all related to something I wanted to share with you called backward design for learning. This is a concept that was developed somewhat recently in like the landscape of adult learning theory, right? And instructional design theory. So backward design for learning is an approach that you can take to designing instruction. Now it's called backward design because, and I'll explain to you what alignment means in just a second, but the idea behind backward design goes back to what we were talking about with the learning outcomes. When we write really clear outcomes, we are able to focus on the thing that our learners are going to need to be able to do, right? So we start with that. We don't start with a textbook. We don't start with, just with materials, right? We have to focus our efforts on what the learners need to be able to actually accomplish. So we start there, and then we move into the assessment for learning. Now, this is a little bit backwards, maybe, right? That's why it's called backward design for learning, because normally your brain kind of goes to a space where you're thinking about, okay, this is what I want my learners to do. Sure, that's fine. But now I'm going to design the instruction. Now I'm going to write my PowerPoint slide, right, based on what they need to do. And that's actually not the way you want to approach this. You actually want to start with those learning outcomes, and then you do the assessments, because that's going to help you stick to the point. So if you come up with a learning outcome and then you come up with an assessment, that's a way for you to know that your learners can do the thing that you wanted them to do. So that way you know that they can meet that outcome. So I'll show you an example of this in just a minute. But the idea is you start with the outcomes, then you design the assessment, and the assessment might be, how do you know that they're gonna that they can do the thing, right? Do you know because you've given them a quiz and they've answered the questions correctly? Or do you know that they can do the thing because you've observed them practicing the skill? Or do they need to write an argumentative essay about it that shows you that they know what they're talking about, right? So that's why we start with the learning outcome and then the assessment, because then that's when we're ready to actually write out our instruction, because we know where we're going with it, and that can help keep us on task. So the idea here is that we are aligning our instructional efforts by engaging in backward design for learning. So when you create something like this, when you start to write down your learning outcomes, your assessments, and your instructional strategies, your instructional plans, lesson plans, whatever it is that you call it, this is the idea of course mapping. Okay, now I'm going to show you what this looks like, because I think that this is really, really valuable for you to understand how this actually plays out in practice. So let me change screens here. So let's look at a very simple one. Now this is a course map, and it's not very pretty, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be pretty. Okay, it doesn't need to be written out on your computer either. You can absolutely do this just by writing with pencil and paper. And you'll actually engage in this in just a minute when we do our first activity. So I want you to create something similar to this that's going to be a lot smaller than this. Okay, we're going to start really, really tiny, but I want to show you what this looks like. Okay, now we're going to start with our learning outcomes, right? That's this first column, and there's several outcomes here. We'll talk about those more in a second. And then we have our assessments, right? So how do we know that they can do the things that are written in these outcomes? We'll assess the students. And then we have our learning activity details. All the rest of the stuff on here is I'll tell you more about those things in just a minute, but we're really focusing on the outcomes, the assessments, and the learning activity details. So here in this example, I write up at the top of the top of all of my course maps, language that says by the end of these modules, right, these lessons or whatever, students will be able to do all of these things, right? They'll be able to become oriented to the course, and they'll be able to locate supportive resources. So that's a thing that I want them to be able to do. I also want them to, this is an artificial intelligence course that I'm teaching right now. One of the things that I want them to be able to do is describe what artificial intelligence means in simple terms. This is what I need them to be able to do. Okay, I also need them to identify various categories of common AI tools and how they can be applied by students and instructors in higher education. And I want them to consider the application of AI to teaching and learning from an equity-centered perspective. Okay, these are the things that I need them to be able to do. How can I tell that they can do these things? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a quiz. Okay, I'm going to give them a syllabus quiz, because that syllabus quiz is going to test their ability to locate supportive resources in the course, right? So you see how that's aligned. I know that they can do that thing. Now, the next thing that I want them to be able to do, again, is to describe what AI is, identify different categories of AI tools, and consider how to apply these things. Now, I'm going to test this in two different ways. I'm going to give them an instructional video quiz, okay? Because in this instructional video quiz, that's how I'm going to deliver the information that they need to be able to accomplish these tasks. So that's my plan, is to develop a quiz. That's a quick thing I can do where they can just do multiple choice answers to just check for understanding. And the big thing that they're going to do in this module is they're going to write a journal reflection that and or participate in a discussion forum that shows that they can describe what AI means in simple terms, that they can identify different categories, and that they consider the application of AI. So these are my 3 assessments that are going to tell me that students can do the thing. And then I have my learning activity details. So this is a fully online course, so they're going to need to watch an orientation video. Okay, that's going to be kind of paired with the things in the syllabus quiz. Then there's going to be another instructional video that's going to talk about the basics of AI and common tools that might be used by students and instructors in higher ed. And then I'm going to have them engage in an entry survey as well. And that's more about assessing them. I assess them at the beginning and I assess them at the end. And that gives me something where I can tell that they have learned in this course. And we'll talk more about different ways of assessing student learning throughout this presentation. But I wanted to show you that this can be really complex or it can be pretty simple. I've included other information in this course map. I've included which module. So that's how I've organized my online course. I've also included topics, so basic, this is almost like learning goal language, and then it's really, really simple, and students can see at a glance what this is going to be all about. And then I've included due dates and I've included grade points because they tend to be more motivated when they know basically how this course is going to be organized. So this course map is something that I use whenever I develop a training or instruction or whatever. But it's really, really important to share this with my students. And this is why I include those grade points information. It is helpful for me to have this information all in one spot as well. But this course map then becomes a valuable learning tool for students so they can see, okay, what's the point of the module? How does this whole thing work, right? So this is why I put more information in it so that students can understand how they're going to engage in the learning. So let's go back. Actually, before we do that, I want to show you one other course map just so you can see. This one is an instructional technology course that I'm teaching, and it's structured a little bit differently, and it's more in depth because it's a much longer course than the AI course. So I have things like important dates on here as well. Again, this is really to help students so that they engage with this resource. But you'll see how I have those learning outcomes, what students should be able to do, assessments, and I explain to students how instructors measure your ability to meet the learning outcomes, and then activities, which mean how your instructors will prepare you to meet the learning outcomes. So again, I'm putting this in language that my students can understand in theory, because it's not just for me, this is for them as well. So this leads us to our next or our first activity. So for our first activity, we are going to write a learning outcome. Just like I shared with you, the learning outcome is you're just going to write in plain language what your students need to be able to do by the end of the lesson, right? Or the end of the course, or however you want to do this. You can do this for a specific week. You can do this for a day. You can do this for a single lesson. Either way is fine. But I want you to write a learning outcome. I also want you to write a corresponding assessment. Now, remember, assessments can be many different things. It can be something like a quiz. It can be a discussion that may be like a face-to-face discussion in the class that you give participation points for. It could be a written paper. It could be that you are observing them in like a practicum type environment. It might be that you're going to give them a case study that they have to analyze with an essay, right? Or present in the class. There's a lot of different ways that you can assess learning. I just want you to be thoughtful about this. Now, these do not have to be perfect, okay? But I want you to write a basic learning outcome, one assessment that matches it. You can write multiple if you'd like, and then one instructional strategy. So remember to do it in that order. Write the learning outcome. What is it that they need to be able to do? How are you going to assess that they can do it? And how are you going to deliver them the instruction that they need to be able to succeed in the assessment? So we're going to take 15 minutes. You're going to do this not on your own. You're going to do this in small groups of 2 to 3. You will have a facilitator that will be able to help manage that a little bit, because I won't be there. But this will allow you to do the activity and have support as needed. So you're going to take 15 minutes. And then as soon as we're done with our learning outcome, assessment, and instructional strategy, and again, more than one is just fine, then we're going to share what we've come up with and just kind of give feedback to each other on it. So now we're going to do 15 minutes starting now. Okay, so at this point, you will have completed your original content. You will have shared. We'll be giving each other feedback on it. So now let's move on to the next principle that we're going to talk about, which is the idea of self-concept in adult learners. So remember, we mentioned earlier that the idea of self-concept is that adult learners are self-directed. They are responsible for their own decisions. This may sound silly, but it is worth mentioning that adults are grown, okay? They want to be active participants in the learning process. When we get to, when we're kids, right, and we're in school, we have this idea that the adults, our teachers, are these experts. They are these sages, right? the concept is sage on the stage, right? Where they are giving us this divine knowledge, right? When we're working with adult learners, we're really more of a guide on the side, right? Because adults are a little bit more capable, right? They're a little bit more independent. And this is a good thing. It's good to allow adults to take responsibility for their own learning rather. So there's a couple of examples of how we can support the idea of self-concept in adult learners. So we can give learners choices. So this can be something like where you give them, let's say you're assigning them an essay to write. That's going to be your assessment. So you can give them the ability to choose the topic of their essay. You could also, if you want them to do a presentation to the class, you could allow them to choose, whatever kind of presentation aids they're going to need. Let's say you want them to use technology or not. You want them to create a poster. Do you want them to get in front of people? Do you want them to lead a group activity? There's lots of ways that you can provide them with this, allow them to take the responsibility, provide them with a sense of autonomy, so that way they can make their own choices. And this can be a very powerful way to motivate our adult learners. You can also encourage goal setting. So allow your learners to set their own goals for what they want to achieve. And then you can check in on that goal progress, right? You can check in and make sure that they're meeting those goals. You could give them feedback on those early goals, so that way they have that level of support. They don't feel alone, but again, they're taking initiative in a way that's helpful. You could also give them the opportunity to engage in leadership roles. So allow them to lead class discussions, allow them to be a group leader as well. That can be something that can be really supportive. And we'll talk more about experience in just a second. But the idea here is that we can give them the opportunity to share their relevant experiences. And that can be very, very powerful. One more thing that we can do is to give frequent feedback to our learners. That's really, really important. And that's extremely motivating as well, because the more feedback they have, the more they're going to be aware of where they are in the course. Things like providing grades very quickly. So not just feedback on like their assignments and how they're doing, but let them know what their grade is. So that way they can assess for themselves how they're doing in the course and if that's acceptable or not. That's a very, very powerful tool. So let's go more into the idea of leveraging experience, because that is our third principle. We know that adults come to our classes with real world and real life experience. That's something that we can leverage to benefit the learning environment. So there's something called constructivist learning theory, and constructivist learning theory suggests that learners actively build new knowledge and meaning. They don't just receive learning. It's something that they're actively engaged with, and they use their experiences to build onto their new knowledge. So it just helps it stick in their brain better when they can relate it to something they've already experienced. So this is something that we should use, right? We can do this with different in-class activities. One example of this is with something like just asking them to share, like maybe you're teaching a concept and you just ask them to share what their experience is with this. Have you experienced this thing that we're talking about? What was that experience like? Give us details. Is there something that you wish you knew then? What do you know now that you wish you knew then? What is a way that you would react differently to the situation, knowing what you know now, that kind of thing. You can also, so this is a great way to leverage the peer-to-peer interaction in this course. So peer-to-peer interaction is so critical that it's actually embedded in some of the accreditation standards. So like for our institutions to exist in a legitimate way, we have to allow for peer-to-peer interaction, because it is so essential to the learning experience. One other thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is that we're building a safe space for our students to share these kinds of things. Our students are not going to share with us if they feel like we're shutting them down, or they feel like they're not adding to the discussion, or if they feel like we're judging them, right? So we want to be a safe space for them to be able to share. And we want them to learn from each other, learn from their experience, and learn from each other. One example of a way that we can incorporate peer-to-peer interaction is with something as simple as an icebreaker kind of discussion. So like when they first get to your class, this is a really nice kind of activity to do. I have one in my class where one of my classes where they pretend they're on a stranded island, right? Like they've washed up on an island. What do they need to survive? What things do they need to be able to survive this experience? And then they talk about it. So it's nothing that's particularly academic. It's nothing, it just kind of allows them to shine in their own ways, and to share their life experience in a different way than they would with a super academic type of assignment. So this is a nice way to also do what's called build community, because when we build community and we build a comfortable, happy space, our learners are just more motivated, and they can also support each other through the course in really powerful ways. So that leads us to our second activity. We are going to do another 15-minute activity where we're going to get in small groups again, groups of 2 or 3. We're going to discuss an idea for an activity where your learners will share their experiences and grow in their knowledge. So think of just any specific kind of thing. Like I shared with you the stranded island activity that I have. So design an activity that allows peers to share their experiences. And then once you have your activity designed, we're going to share our activities. So you can do more than one. And then we can, just whatever time allows, then we can share those activities and see what we think and see what we can learn from each other. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording here so that way you can take those 15 minutes and engage in the activity. Okay, so in theory, we've done the 15-minute activity and we've done some sharing. So now let's get into the fourth principle, readiness to learn. So adults are ready to learn when they understand the relevance. They have to know what's the point of this exercise, right? What's the point of the information that they're being asked to keep in their brains, right? So they have to understand the relevance. And again, that's why we do that course mapping activity, because we want you to be able to explain to them what the relevance is, so that way they can understand it and they can do something with that. But another thing that's important to discuss in general when working with adult learners is their readiness to learn, not just from an emotional standpoint, but from a standpoint of, are they ready to engage with the concepts, with the subject matter? Are they at an appropriate level. So have they gotten the supportive and baseline concepts that they need to build up to your subject matter? So like, think about this for a minute, right? What do students need to be able to do before getting to your class? Do they need to be able to read? Do they need to be able to write? Do they need to be able to understand the basics of social work, right? Whatever the thing is, you want to think about that, right? Because this is, we want to be able to assess their readiness, but we also want to provide opportunities that are appropriate for remediation. So when I say remediation, I just mean, what do they need to catch up on, right? Because not every single learner is going to be 100% prepared and 100% ready to learn, whether they're emotionally ready to learn or they're just not ready for the concepts. So it's important to provide remediation opportunities throughout your class. Now that can look like take-home activities, take-home readings, things where you just give them the support and you give them the instruction that they need, like, so they understand what they need to catch up with. And they may not be able to catch up overnight with this kinds of stuff. But if you're getting them to write an essay, for example, do you need to give them some take-home grammar activities, right? What are the things that you can do to support all of your learners? And in the same way that you want to provide opportunities for remediation, for people to catch up, you also want to provide your learners with opportunities to engage with the content in a more advanced way. So how are you keeping their interest by giving them those advanced opportunities? Because if they come into your training or your lesson or whatever it is, and they feel like they already know all of it and they are not interested, you're not going to have an engaged learner. You're not going to have a learner that feels like they're going to get something out of the session. So provide opportunities for them to catch up and provide opportunities for them to engage with the content a little more deeply. Maybe you give them just give them a reading list, right? A reading list that has both of these things on it. So that way you have some basic stuff on there and you have more advanced stuff on there that plays into that idea that we talked about, where they have the choice to engage with optional learning materials that suit whatever their individualized level is in the course. There's another concept that I want to introduce you to, and it's the idea of, it's a concept called universal design theory for learning. When we're actually in the live session, I will be asking how many people know about this concept, because it's something that not everybody knows about, but it's an important one to think about. So the idea behind universal design for learning, UDL, is that we are not making big assumptions about the physical or mental abilities of our learners. So it may be that we have learners who have who need accommodations for mental disabilities, right? Physical disabilities. So if you are teaching a course and everybody needs to write down their ideas, do you know with 100% certainty that every single adult learner that you're going to have has the use of one or both of their hands, right? We don't know that. So it's important to approach our course design and our instructional design processes with that in mind. Okay, right? Like, so here's my activity. This is what I want them to be able to do. Now, how can you design an alternative for students to engage in who suffer from PTSD, right? Who suffer from, physical disabilities where they can't engage with something in the same way. So just think about, when you map out your course, think about ways that you can remove barriers for your students through that lens of universal design theory for learning. So now we're going to go into the fifth principle, which is that adult learners and adult learning is solution oriented. So I'm going to mention three things here. The first is the idea of problem-based learning. So there are a ton of studies out there that talk about this idea of problem-based learning. Basically, when we provide students with problems that they can solve, they're more motivated because they want to find the solution to the problem. Now, we can do this by giving them things like case studies. Okay, we can do this by putting them into simulations. And when I say simulations, maybe what you think of is something that's like really, really high tech, where we are putting them in a virtual reality environment or putting them in some kind of online simulation where they are like a flight simulator, right? Where they're learning how to fly a plane and they're in a flight simulator where it's all very high tech, right? But simulations don't need to be that high tech. All we need to do is simulate the experience that they might have in their future careers or out in the field, right? So we can do this by doing things like role playing, right? Where students can be given a scenario that they have to imagine themselves in, and then they react to the scenario based on whatever principle that you're learning, right? Whatever technique you're teaching them. So, and we can get high tech with simulations, but we do not need to. One thing that I recommend you do, and I put a note for myself to mention this here, because we're talking about high tech things. So we're not going to do an entire, like we could do an entire session about artificial intelligence tools. But one thing I want to bring your attention to is the potential for using an artificial intelligence tool, something like ChatGPT or something similar, something that generates text based on a prompt that you give it. So you can actually go into some of these free tools and you can write something out and say, hey, I would like you to give me a scenario that students might find themselves in as social workers or as aspiring social workers, where they have to put this core concept into play. And you will be amazed by how generative AI can write pretty much instantly a scenario that you can then, look at as the expert, and you can think about it and you can say, ooh, this is a good one, or no, this is not a good one, or ooh, this is a good idea. And then you can present that to your students. So it's a way that you can create different kinds of activities for them that are very personalized. Now think back to the idea of like autonomy, right? And self-concept. So adults are, they're motivated by those personalized kinds of learning opportunities where they can choose which thing to pursue. Now, traditionally, if you or I are sitting down and we're writing out a scenario for our students to engage in, that is very time consuming. It takes our brains a while to think of it. It takes ourselves a while to write down the idea. And then we have one great activity for the whole class to do. But if you can leverage a tool like artificial intelligence, and you can have it generate in 30 seconds 6 or 7 different scenarios for problem-based learning, or different scenarios for them to envision themselves in. Well, now you can provide all those different scenarios. You do it on the computer, you print it out. Now you have multiple activities, and now your adult learners can choose whichever one appeals to them and their interests. So there's different ways that we can leverage all of these concepts and use them together. Like, we don't need to do just one thing at a time, right? We can leverage a lot of these different concepts so that we were designing instruction that is motivating and engaging. And speaking of motivation, our next principle, principle 6, is all about intrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic just means internal, right? And I'll give you an example of intrinsic versus external motivation. If I offer you a piece of candy to do a task, that is external motivation, right? Kids tend to be very externally motivated to engage in learning, right? If you do this, you're going to get a reward. If you, this will allow you to move to the next level, whatever it is. Adults, on the other hand, are very internally motivated to learn. But in order to intrinsically motivate, for us to have an impact on their internal motivating factors, we have to understand what motivates them. And so there's the idea of a thing called motivational interviewing, and you can use this in higher education when we're working with adult learners. So there's different ways that you can do this. So you can do things like talk to them with an empathetic tone. You can do this so that it's clear, again, you're doing that safe space kind of thing where you're not judging them. You are trying to understand what your learner's perspective is. And this can be something that can motivate them to engage in learning, which is effectively a change, right? Like they are changing something about themselves. They're enhancing something about themselves. They're learning something new. They're learning new skills. They're enhancing their skill set. And we can motivate them to do so just by talking to them in a really nice, kind, empathetic manner. We can also we can talk to them about why they're here, right? Why they're here, why they're learning. Because when you're an adult, you don't have to go to school anymore, right? You don't have to. You don't have to do anything. When you're a kid, you have to go to school. When you're an adult, you do not have to. So help me understand why you're here. Help me understand why you're going through the pain in the neck that school is. Why are you doing it, right? And that, just them sharing that with you, or even if you don't have them answer you, even if you just have them think about it, that can be something that's really powerful. An example of a way that you can do this is just through journaling. And maybe you encourage them to do journaling activities where you are not seeing the journal. But you know that they're journaling because in the class, you're having them journal and they close their book when they're done and they take it with them. You are not looking at it. Okay. That's a way that you can key into some of that intrinsic motivation. You are amplifying their own internal motivating factors. There's a lot of other ideas for this. And I want to make sure that we have time. So we're going to jump into the third activity, which is to create, again, we're going to do this in small groups. We're going to create another in-class activity to enhance your students' motivation and their readiness. So you're trying to uncover their motivation. What is it that motivates them? How will you engage how will you allow your students to engage in real world problem solving, right? How can you support their readiness to learn through those remediation activities, through the advanced learning opportunities? And how are you going to remove barriers? So when you create this in-class activity, I want you to be thinking about all of these things. Remember universal design for learning. Right? When you are designing an activity, how are you going to be inclusive in the way that you design that activity? So we're going to do another 15 minutes of working in small groups to design either one activity or a couple different activities. Think about all these different elements that, you've got swimming around in your head at this point. And then we're going to do some more sharing. So I'll go ahead and pause the presentation. So by now you've engaged in the third activity. You have shared, and we've shared ideas and critiques for all these different activities. So now we're approaching the end of the presentation here. So in review, I do want you to think about or share some of those key takeaways. So I want you to think about, what's the most important principle that you intend to integrate into your practice, and how will you accomplish this? So we'll go around the room and we'll hear from a lot of different people. So again, if you're watching this on your own, just think about what you've learned. Think about what you intend to integrate and how you will do that. And that's about it. So you have identified 6 adult learning theory principles. You have also applied adult learning principles to your developing teaching practices. You've also strategized how to implement practical activities that will inspire your students as adult learners. And you've been able to articulate the importance of integrating adult learning principles as related to the social work program and the work-based practicum. So all of those individualized activities that you did should have supported the social work program and the practicum. So I hope that you gained something from this exercise. And for anyone who wants to connect with me, please feel free to do so on LinkedIn. My link is up here on the screen. It's linkedin.com/in/Laura Lark Otero. If you just look up Laura Otero and CSUMB, I'm sure that I will come up. Or you can visit my website if you would like as well, and just learn more, and just go to lauraoterophd.com. And what a privilege it is to work on this project. This has been really, really special. And I am looking forward to connecting with more folks in the future. So thanks so much for having me. And I hope that these principles serve you well in your own teaching practice. Take care.